My ex left me with a toddler and disappeared for years, then demanded I let her claim him for tax season. So I sent her one reply she'll never forget. I'm 30 years old, and 4 years ago my ex-girlfriend Amber walked out on me and our 2-year-old son Blake, claiming she needed to find herself and couldn't handle the responsibility of being a mother. Last month, she had the audacity to contact me demanding that I let her claim Blake as a dependent on her taxes, acting like she deserved some kind of financial reward for being his biological mother despite abandoning him when he needed her most. Let me start from the beginning so you understand exactly what kind of person I'm dealing with. Amber and I met when we were both 24, working at the same restaurant downtown. She was a server, I was a line cook, and we hit it off immediately. She was funny, spontaneous, and had this infectious energy that made even the worst shifts bearable. We moved in together after 6 months, and everything seemed perfect. When Amber got pregnant, I was terrified but excited. I'd always wanted kids eventually, and even though we weren't married and were barely making ends meet, I thought we could figure it out together. Amber seemed happy about the pregnancy at first, talking about baby names and nursery decorations, making plans for our little family. Blake was born healthy and beautiful, and for the first few months, Amber seemed to adjust to motherhood reasonably well. Sure, she complained about being tired and stressed, but that's normal for new parents. I was working double shifts at the restaurant to cover our expenses while she stayed home with Blake, and I thought we were doing okay considering the circumstances. But something started changing when Blake turned about 8 months old. Amber became increasingly resentful about being stuck at home while I got to escape to work every day. She'd make comments about how I didn't understand what it was like to be responsible for a baby 24/7, how I got to have adult conversations while she was trapped with someone who couldn't even talk back. I tried to be supportive. I'd take over with Blake the moment I got home from work, handle all the night feedings on weekends, and encourage Amber to go out with friends when she needed a break. But nothing I did seemed to help her growing frustration with her situation. The complaints escalated over the next year. Amber started talking about how she'd given up her dreams and her freedom for a baby she wasn't sure she'd wanted in the first place. She'd make cruel comments about how Blake was clingy and demanding, how she felt like she was losing herself in the endless cycle of diapers and feeding schedules. I suggested counseling, thinking maybe she was dealing with postpartum depression, but Amber brushed off the idea. She said what she needed wasn't therapy but space to figure out who she was outside of being someone's mother. She started going out more often, staying late at bars with friends, leaving me to handle bedtime routines and middle-of-the-night wake-ups even after working 12-hour shifts. The breaking point came when Blake was 2 years old. I came home from work one evening to find him crying in his crib, hungry and with a soiled diaper that had clearly been unchanged for hours. Amber was nowhere to be found. Her car was gone, and she wasn't answering her phone. She showed up 3 hours later, drunk and defensive, claiming she just needed some air and had lost track of time. When I confronted her about leaving Blake alone and neglected, she exploded. She screamed about how I didn't appreciate everything she sacrificed, how I expected her to be a perfect mother when she never asked for this responsibility. That fight lasted until 3 a.m., with Blake crying in the background while Amber ranted about feeling trapped and unfulfilled. She said she was tired of pretending to be happy playing house when all she wanted was her old life back. I tried to reason with her, suggesting we could find better childcare solutions or ways for her to pursue her interests while still being present for Blake. But Amber had already made up her mind. The next morning, while I was at work, she packed her clothes and personal belongings. I came home to find Blake sitting on the living room floor with a note propped against his toy box. The note said Amber needed time to figure herself out and that she couldn't be the mother Blake deserved right now. She said she was moving back in with her parents in another state and would contact me when she was ready to be involved in his life again. That was 4 years ago. Blake is now 6 years old, and in all that time, Amber has had minimal contact with him. She's called maybe a dozen times, sent a birthday card twice, and saw him for a total of 6 hours during one awkward visit when she was in town for a friend's wedding 2 years ago. Meanwhile, I've been Blake's sole parent, handling everything from diaper changes to homework, help to scrape knees and bedtime stories. I left the restaurant industry and got my HVAC certification so I could have more stable hours and better benefits. I've arranged my entire life around Blake's needs, turning down job opportunities that would require travel and dating very carefully to make sure any woman I bring into our lives understands that Blake comes first. Blake has thrived despite his mother's absence. He's a happy, confident kid who excels in school and has great friends. He occasionally asks about his mom, and I've always been honest in age-appropriate ways about why she's not around. I've never badmouthed Amber to him, but I've also never made excuses for her choices. So when I got a text message from Amber last month asking if we could work something out for tax season, My first reaction was confusion. Work what out? She'd made her choice years ago when she decided being a mother was too difficult and walked away from her responsibilities. But Amber's follow-up messages made her intentions crystal clear. She wanted me to agree not to claim Blake as a dependent on my taxes so she could claim him instead. She'd done some research and discovered that the child tax credit and other deductions could net her several $1,000s in refunds. Money she apparently felt entitled to despite contributing nothing to Blake's care or expenses for the past 4 years. After the initial shock of Amber's request wore off, I decided to ignore her messages and hope she'd drop the subject. I mean, surely she couldn't be serious about claiming tax benefits for a child she'd abandoned and barely seen in 4 years. But Amber wasn't dropping anything. The messages kept coming, each one more entitled than the last. She started by being sweet and reasonable, talking about how we should co-parent the financial benefits even though we weren't co-parenting anything else. When I didn't respond, her tone shifted to frustrated and demanding. "I know you got my messages," she texted. "This isn't unreasonable. I'm his mother and I have rights too." Rights? She wanted to talk about rights after walking away from every responsibility that comes with those rights. Then came the guilt trip messages. Amber started talking about how hard things had been for her, how she'd struggled to get back on her feet after leaving, how she was just trying to build a stable life so she could eventually be more involved with Blake. She made it sound like claiming him on her taxes was somehow part of a plan to become a better mother. "I'm trying to get my life together so I can be there for Blake," she wrote. "This money would help me get ahead financially so I can provide for him better in the future." The manipulation was infuriating. Amber was essentially asking me to subsidize her life with money that was meant to help with Blake's expenses, based on the promise that someday she might decide to be a real parent. When the guilt trips didn't work, she escalated to threats. She started researching family law and sending me links to articles about parental rights and tax claims. She found some legal website that explained how biological parents can sometimes claim children even if they don't have primary custody, and she seemed to think this gave her leverage. "I talked to a lawyer," she texted, though I seriously doubted she'd actually paid for legal consultation. "I have just as much right to claim Blake as you do. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." The hard way. Like she was in any position to make threats after abandoning her child for 4 years. But the message that really set me off came on a Sunday morning while Blake and I were making pancakes together. My phone buzzed with a long text from Amber that made my blood boil. "I've been thinking about this situation, and I realize I need to be more assertive about my parental rights. Blake is my son too, and I've been too passive about maintaining my connection with him. I think it's time I started having regular visitation and being more involved in his life. But first, we need to resolve this tax situation fairly. I'm not trying to take anything away from you, but I deserve to benefit from being Blake's mother just like you benefit from being his father. I know I haven't been as present as I should have been, but I'm ready to step up now. Let's start with alternating years for tax claims, and then we can work out a custody schedule that works for everyone." The sheer audacity of that message left me speechless. Amber was treating Blake like a financial asset she could claim whenever it benefited her, while simultaneously threatening to disrupt his stable life with sudden demands for custody. She'd been absent for 4 years, but now that there was money involved, she was ready to step up and be a mother. What made it worse was the timing. Blake had just started asking more questions about why his mom wasn't around. A few weeks earlier, he'd come home from school upset because his friend's mom had volunteered for a field trip, and Blake had realized he was one of the few kids who never had their mom show up for school events. "Why doesn't my mom want to see me?" he'd asked, and I'd had to carefully explain that sometimes adults make choices that don't have anything to do with how much they love their kids. I'd reassured him that he was loved and wanted, that his mom's absence wasn't his fault, and that our little family was complete and happy just the way it was. Now Amber was threatening to waltz back into Blake's life not because she'd suddenly developed maternal instincts, but because she wanted money and thought she could use the threat of custody disruption to get it. I realized I needed to document everything. I started screenshotting all of Amber's messages, printing out our text conversations, and organizing 4 years' worth of evidence showing her complete absence from Blake's life. If she wanted to play legal hardball, I was going to be prepared. But first, I needed to understand exactly what she was trying to claim and whether she had any legal standing to do so. I spent hours researching tax law and parental rights, and what I discovered made me even angrier. To claim a child as a dependent, you generally need to provide more than half of their financial support during the tax year. Amber hadn't contributed a single dollar to Blake's care in 4 years. She hadn't paid for food, clothing, housing, medical care, child care, or any other expense related to raising him. She was essentially trying to commit tax fraud while using Blake as leverage to get back into our lives on her terms. But Amber had no idea what kind of documentation I had or how prepared I was to fight back. Her reasoning was that since she was Blake's biological mother, she had as much right to the tax benefits as I did. She suggested we could alternate years or split the refund money. She even had the nerve to frame it as being fair, since she was struggling financially and could really use the extra money. I stared at those messages in complete disbelief. This woman who had abandoned her son because motherhood was too inconvenient now wanted to profit from his existence when tax season rolled around. The audacity was breathtaking. It was time to craft a response she'd never forget. Before responding to Amber's increasingly aggressive demands, I decided to compile a comprehensive record of her absence from Blake's life. If she wanted to play the legal card and threaten custody disruption over tax money, I was going to make sure I had every piece of evidence documenting her abandonment. I started with the financial records. Over the past 4 years, I'd kept meticulous track of every expense related to Blake's care, partly out of necessity as a single parent managing a tight budget, and partly because my mom had always taught me to keep good records for tax purposes. What I found when I organized everything was staggering. Blake's expenses for the past 4 years totaled over $47,000. This included daycare costs when he was younger, food, clothing, medical expenses, school supplies, extracurricular activities, and basic necessities like housing and utilities. I had receipts, bank statements, and credit card records documenting every penny I'd spent raising him. Amber's financial contribution during that same period, $0. But the financial abandonment was just the beginning. I pulled together evidence of her complete absence from Blake's emotional and physical care as well. I had her own text messages from years ago where she complained about not wanting to be a mother and needing space to find herself. I had documentation showing she'd missed every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone in Blake's life. I gathered school records showing that I was the only parent listed for emergency contacts, parent-teacher conferences, and field trip permissions. I had medical records from Blake's pediatrician showing that I was the sole guardian bringing him to appointments and making healthcare decisions. The most damaging evidence came from Blake's own innocent documentation of his life. I looked through 4 years of his artwork, school projects, and family drawings. In every single picture of his family, it was just him and me. When his teachers had assigned projects about family traditions or my mom essays, Blake had either written about how he didn't have a mom or had chosen to write about his grandmother instead. I found a heartbreaking Father's Day card Blake had made at school when he was 4, where he'd drawn a picture of us playing catch and written in his shaky handwriting, "My dad takes care of me and loves me every day." On the back, he'd drawn a picture of what he thought his mom might look like, with a question mark next to it. But I also documented evidence of how well Blake was thriving despite Amber's absence. His report cards showed excellent grades and positive teacher comments about his behavior and social development. I had photos from birthday parties, school events, little league games, and family gatherings where Blake was clearly happy and well-adjusted. I'd built a life for Blake that was stable, loving, and complete. He had routines, friendships, activities he enjoyed, and a strong relationship with my parents who served as his surrogate grandparents. He wasn't lacking anything except a mother who'd chosen not to be present. The evidence also showed Amber's sporadic and minimal attempts at contact. I had records of exactly 12 phone calls over 4 years, most lasting less than 10 minutes. She'd sent 2 birthday cards and 1 Christmas gift, a toy she'd clearly picked up at a gas station that was inappropriate for Blake's age. The most telling evidence was from her single in-person visit 2 years ago. She contacted me saying she was in town for a friend's wedding and wanted to see Blake. I'd agreed, hoping it might be the start of her taking more responsibility, but instead it had been a disaster. Amber had shown up late, stayed for only 6 hours, and spent most of that time on her phone or complaining about how much Blake had changed. She'd brought him a random toy she'd grabbed at the airport and seemed annoyed when he was shy around her. When Blake had asked if she was going to start visiting more often, she'd given him a vague answer about maybe coming back soon. After she left, Blake had been confused and upset for weeks. He'd kept asking when his mom was coming back and why she seemed like a stranger. I'd had to help him process the disappointment when days turned into weeks with no follow-up contact from Amber. I also documented Amber's current life through her very public social media presence. Her Instagram and Facebook pages told the story of someone who was living a completely self-centered lifestyle with no room for parental responsibilities. Photos from bars and parties, vacation trips, concerts, and expensive purchases that showed she clearly had money for herself but had never considered sending any support for Blake. Her posts never mentioned having a child. To anyone looking at her social media, you'd think she was a carefree single woman in her 20s with no responsibilities beyond her own entertainment. She completely erased Blake from her public identity. But the most damning evidence was a screenshot I'd taken of a Facebook conversation between Amber and one of her friends from last year. They'd been planning a girls' trip to Mexico, and when her friend had jokingly asked about finding a babysitter, Amber had responded, "What babysitter? I don't have kids to worry about. I don't have kids to worry about." Those words perfectly captured Amber's mindset. She'd mentally and emotionally divorced herself from Blake's existence, except apparently when it came to potential financial benefits. Armed with this comprehensive documentation, I began drafting my response to Amber's demands. But I realized I needed to understand the legal implications of what she was proposing before I shut her down completely. I consulted with a family law attorney who confirmed what I already suspected. Amber had no legal standing to claim Blake as a dependent since she'd provided zero financial support and had no custody arrangement. Her threats about asserting parental rights were empty since she'd legally abandoned him and would have to go through the courts to establish any kind of visitation or custody. The attorney also explained that Amber's plan to claim Blake on her taxes when she provided no support could constitute tax fraud. The IRS requires the person claiming a child to have provided more than half of their financial support during the tax year. Amber's claim would be easily disputed with my documentation. With legal backing and overwhelming evidence of Amber's abandonment, I was ready to craft a response that would end her tax scheme and make it clear that Blake's well-being would never be secondary to her financial interests. After spending days organizing evidence and consulting with my attorney, I sat down to write a response that would end Amber's tax scheme once and for all. I wanted to be thorough, factual, and completely devastating. This wasn't just about money, it was about protecting Blake from a mother who saw him as a financial opportunity rather than a human being she'd abandoned. Here's the email I sent her. Amber, I received your messages about claiming Blake on your taxes, and I want to address your request with the same level of consideration you've shown our son over the past 4 years. Let me start with the legal facts, since you mentioned consulting a lawyer. To claim a child as a dependent on your taxes, IRS regulations require that you provide more than 50% of their financial support during the tax year. I have documentation showing that your financial contribution to Blake's care over the past 4 years totals exactly $0. Here's what Blake's care has actually cost during the time you've been finding yourself. Daycare and after-school care, $18,400. Food and groceries, $8,200. Clothing and shoes, $3,800. Medical expenses and insurance, $6,900. Housing costs, $7,200. School supplies and activities, $1,800. Miscellaneous necessities, $1,700. Total, $47,000 over 4 years. Your contribution, $0. But let's talk about more than just money, since you want to discuss your parental rights. I've documented every interaction you've had with Blake since you abandoned him at age 2. Phone calls, 12 total over 4 years, averaging 8 minutes each. Birthday acknowledgments, 2 cards out of 4 birthdays. Christmas contact, 1 gas station toy. In-person visits, 1 visit for 6 hours in 4 years. Contribution to school events, medical appointments, or daily care, 0. I have 4 years of Blake's artwork where he draws his family as just him and me. I have school projects where he writes about not having a mom. I have the recording of him crying after your single visit 2 years ago, asking why his mom seemed like a stranger and when you were coming back. You want to know what Blake asked me last month? He asked if the reason his mom doesn't visit is because he did something wrong. I had to explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes adults make choices that have nothing to do with how wonderful their children are. But here's what really tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. You've had my phone number for 4 years. You could have called Blake anytime. You could have video chatted with him, sent him letters, been involved in his life in any meaningful way. Instead, the first time you reach out in months is to ask for money. You're not asking to see Blake. You're not asking how he's doing in school or what his favorite activities are. You're not asking about his friends or his interests or his dreams. You want to know if you can profit from his existence while continuing to ignore his actual needs. Since you mentioned getting legal advice, let me share what my attorney told me about your parental rights. In our state, a parent who abandons their child for an extended period without providing support or maintaining contact can have their parental rights challenged. Your 4-year absence, combined with 0 financial contribution and minimal contact, constitutes legal abandonment. If you want to pursue your rights in court, I welcome that conversation. I have documentation of every day I've been Blake's sole parent while you've been living as if you don't have a child. I have evidence of every sacrifice I've made to give him a stable, loving home while you've been posting vacation photos and party pictures on social media. Speaking of social media, I noticed you told your friend last year that you don't have kids to worry about when planning your Mexico trip. I screenshotted that conversation, along with the dozens of posts showing you spending money on entertainment, travel, and yourself while never once mentioning or supporting the child you claim to have rights to. Here's what's going to happen with the tax situation. I will be claiming Blake as my dependent, as I have every right to do since I've provided 100% of his financial support and care. If you attempt to claim him as well, I will dispute it with the IRS using 4 years of documentation proving you've contributed nothing to his support. If you file a fraudulent tax claim, I will report it to the appropriate authorities and provide evidence of your abandonment and lack of financial contribution. Tax fraud is a federal crime, and claiming a child you don't support financially constitutes fraud. But let's say you're serious about wanting to be involved in Blake's life rather than just his tax benefits. Here's what that would actually look like. First, you'd need to establish a consistent pattern of contact and support. That means regular phone calls, birthday and holiday gifts, and actual visits where you focus on Blake instead of your phone. Second, you'd need to start contributing financially to his care. I'll provide you with a monthly expense report, and you can begin paying your share of his costs going forward. Third, any custody or visitation arrangement would need to be court-approved and in Blake's best interest, not your convenience. That means building a relationship gradually and proving you can be a stable, consistent presence in his life. But honestly, Amber, I don't think you want any of that responsibility. I think you want the financial benefits of being a parent without any of the actual work. You want to claim him when it profits you and ignore him when it doesn't. Blake deserves better than that. He deserves better than a mother who sees him as a tax write-off. He deserves better than someone who only remembers he exists when there's money involved. So here's my final answer to your request. No, you cannot claim Blake on your taxes. You have no legal standing to do so, and I will fight any attempt you make to profit from a child you abandoned. If you want to be part of Blake's life, it starts with actually caring about Blake, not about what Blake can do for your bank account. Until then, stop contacting me about money and start asking yourself why your first thought about your son in months was how much he might be worth at tax time. Blake is thriving without you, but the door is always open if you want to be an actual mother instead of just a biological contributor looking for a payday. Thomas. I never heard from Amber again. 3 months later, Blake asked me why his mom didn't love him enough to visit. I told him that sometimes people aren't ready to be parents, but that doesn't reflect anything about how lovable he is. Some people see children as responsibilities to escape. Others see them as opportunities to exploit. The best parents see them as precious gifts worth any sacrifice. Blake and I are doing just fine without anyone who can't tell the difference.